On December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, they initiated what would become one of the most catastrophic strategic miscalculations in military history. Within 4 years, Japan would lie in ruins, 2 of its cities vaporized by atomic weapons, its empire dissolved, and its military completely destroyed. The question that has puzzled historians for 8 decades is simple yet profound. Why did Japan's military and political leadership believe they could defeat the United States, a nation with 10 times their industrial capacity and vast natural resources? The answer, as I discovered through extensive research into Japanese military archives, intelligence assessments, and post-war interrogations, reveals a complex web of strategic desperation, cultural blindness, and catastrophic intelligence failures that led an entire nation into a war they could not win. I'm Frank Dawson. This is an investigation of why Japan thought they could defeat America in World War II. Before we dive into this story, please give this video a like. It really helps push the video to more viewers and supports the channel. To understand Japan's strategic thinking in 1941, we must first examine the intelligence apparatus that fed information to Tokyo's decision-makers. The Japanese military intelligence services, despite their reputation for efficiency in China and Southeast Asia, suffered from a fundamental flaw that would prove fatal. They systematically underestimated American industrial capacity by staggering margins. According to documents from the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Archives, now housed at Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, Japanese naval intelligence in 1941 estimated that the United States could produce approximately 1 fleet carrier per year. The actual figure, as we now know, was 141 carriers of all types built during the war. This wasn't merely an error of degree, it was an error of conceptual understanding. Japanese analysts simply could not comprehend the scale of American mass production capabilities. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Yamamoto, was one of the few senior Japanese officers who truly understood what his nation was about to face. Yamamoto had served as a naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s and had traveled extensively throughout the United States. He had visited Detroit's automobile factories and witnessed American industrial might firsthand. His famous warning to the Japanese government has been often quoted, but rarely understood in its full context. Quote, "I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." This was not merely pessimism, it was a mathematical certainty based on industrial capacity. Yet Yamamoto's warnings were systematically ignored or downplayed by Japan's army-dominated government and the increasingly radical militarist faction that controlled policy by 1941. The question then becomes, if Japan's most experienced naval strategist knew the war was unwinnable, why did Japan proceed? The answer lies in what Japanese historians have termed the July Crisis of 1941. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8832, freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch East Indies immediately followed suit. Most critically, this included a total oil embargo. Japan's strategic petroleum reserves in July 1941 stood at approximately 55 million barrels. Japanese military operations and industry consumed roughly 12,400 barrels per day. Simple arithmetic revealed a terrifying timeline. Japan had at most 18 to 24 months of oil remaining before its fleet would be unable to sail and its air force unable to fly. This created what Japanese planners called the automatic deadline, or Jido Kigen. Documents from the Japanese Army General Staff, interrogated after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, reveal the stark choice facing Tokyo's leadership. Option 1. Accept American demands to withdraw from China and Indochina, abandoning everything Japan had fought for since 1931. This was politically impossible. The military government had invested too much prestige and too many lives in the China campaign. Such a withdrawal would have likely resulted in the government's collapse and possible assassination of its leaders by radical junior officers. Option 2. Seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields by force and accept war with Britain, the Netherlands, and inevitably the United States. Option 3. Do nothing and watch Japan's military power evaporate as the oil ran out, leaving the nation defenseless. Faced with these choices, Japan's leaders chose war, but war based on a strategy that reveals the depth of their miscalculation. The operational plan that emerged was called the Southern Operation, or Nampo Sakusen. The concept was straightforward in theory, but revealed fundamental misunderstandings about American psychology and capabilities. Phase 1. Deliver a devastating blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, crippling American naval power for 6 to 12 months. Phase 2. Simultaneously seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines, creating a defensive perimeter. Phase 3. Fortify this perimeter with island strongpoints, making any American counteroffensive prohibitively costly. Phase 4. And this is where the plan becomes truly delusional. Wait for the Americans to negotiate a peace settlement, accepting Japan's new empire in exchange for ending the war. This fourth phase rested on a series of assumptions about American national character that were not merely wrong, but catastrophically so. Japanese intelligence reports from 1940 to 1941, many of which I examined at the National Diet Library in Tokyo, consistently characterized Americans as individualistic, comfort-loving, and lacking in warrior spirit. Quote, "The American people, addicted to luxury and materialism, will not tolerate a long war requiring sacrifice." End quote. This assessment came from a Japanese Army intelligence summary, dated November 1941. The irony, of course, is that this description might have accurately characterized America in peacetime, but catastrophically misread how Americans would respond to a surprise attack on their territory. The cultural dimension of Japan's miscalculation cannot be overstated. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, permeated Japanese military thinking in the 1930s and 40s. This wasn't the historical Bushido of the samurai era, but a militarized, radicalized version promoted by ultra-nationalist theorists. According to this ideology, spiritual power and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese soldiers were taught that one Japanese soldier equaled 10 Americans or British because of superior morale and willingness to die. The Battle of Singapore in February 1942 seemed to confirm this belief when 30,000 Japanese troops forced the surrender of 85,000 British Commonwealth forces. What Japanese planners failed to understand was that this victory said more about British unpreparedness and poor leadership than about any inherent superiority of Japanese forces. This brings us to what historians have called victory disease, a term the Japanese themselves used after the war. The rapid succession of victories from December 1941 through May 1942, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, created a dangerous overconfidence. Lieutenant General Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Imperial Japanese Army's most influential planners, wrote in his post-war memoir that by March 1942, quote, "We had come to believe that Japanese fighting power was invincible and that we could achieve any objective we set ourselves." End quote. The ease of these early victories obscured a crucial reality. Japan was defeating colonial powers with limited forces in Asia, not the full might of the United States mobilizing for total war. The intelligence failure regarding American production capacity deserves closer examination because it reveals systematic flaws in Japanese information gathering. Japanese naval attachés in Washington up until Pearl Harbor regularly sent reports to Tokyo. These reports mentioned American shipbuilding programs and aircraft production, So why did Japanese planners discount this information? The answer lies in a cognitive bias that affects all intelligence analysis, the tendency to reject information that contradicts established beliefs. Japanese planners had convinced themselves that American democracy and capitalism made rapid military mobilization impossible. They believed that labor unions would resist militarization, that competing corporations would refuse to cooperate, and that political divisions would paralyze decision-making. Therefore, when reports arrived showing American industrial plans, these were dismissed as propaganda or unrealistic projections. The reality was precisely the opposite. American corporations, from Ford to General Motors to Boeing, converted to war production with stunning speed. Labor unions declared no-strike pledges. Political parties united behind the war effort. The arsenal of democracy that President Roosevelt had promised became a terrifying reality for Japan. By 1943, the United States was producing more war material than all other combatants combined, including its allies. A single American shipyard, Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California, could build a Liberty ship in an average of 42 days. At peak production in 1943, American shipyards launched one vessel every 6 hours. Japanese intelligence had predicted nothing remotely close to this scale. Perhaps the most damning evidence of Japanese miscalculation comes from the interrogations conducted after the war. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed hundreds of Japanese military and political leaders. When asked when they first realized the war was lost, the answers cluster around two moments. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, barely 6 months into the war, and after the loss of the Marianas in 1944. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction had been precisely accurate. Japan ran wild for 6 months. Then everything began to unravel. What's striking in these interrogations is how many Japanese leaders admitted they had known from the beginning that the war was unwinnable, but felt they had no choice. This brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing aspect of Japan's decision to go to war: the political impossibility of choosing peace. By 1941, Japan's political system had been captured by a radical military faction that viewed any compromise as betrayal. The assassinations of moderate politicians throughout the 1930s had created a climate of fear where advocating negotiation with the United States was literally life-threatening. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, who sought to avoid war with America, was forced to resign in October 1941 because the military refused to accept his diplomatic approach. His successor, General Hideki Tojo, was selected precisely because he was willing to lead Japan to war. The institutional structure of Japan's government also contributed to this disaster. The military held effective veto power over cabinet formation and could topple any government by having the Army or Navy minister resign. No replacement could be appointed without the military's approval. This meant that even if a majority of politicians wanted to avoid war, they were powerless to prevent it. The military, particularly the Army faction, had convinced itself that war with America was inevitable, and therefore should be fought while Japan still had oil reserves, and before American rearmament made the disparity in power even greater. There's a final element that deserves mention: racism and cultural contempt. Japanese military education in the 1930s systematically taught that Western powers, particularly Americans, were decadent and racially inferior. Training manuals described Americans as soft, undisciplined, and cowardly. This wasn't merely propaganda, it was a genuine belief held at the highest levels. When these beliefs collided with reality, as they did at Guadalcanal in 1942 to 1943, when American Marines proved equal or superior to Japanese forces in jungle warfare, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Rather than adjusting their assumptions, many Japanese commanders doubled down, attributing defeats to insufficient fighting spirit rather than material and tactical factors. The economic calculations that should have prevented the war were either ignored or rationalized away. In 1941, the United States produced 17 times more steel than Japan, 7 times more coal, 80 times more oil, and possessed 5 times the electrical generating capacity. American GDP was approximately 11 times that of Japan. These weren't secrets. Japanese economic planners had access to this data. But the military leadership chose to emphasize intangible factors: fighting spirit, tactical superiority, better training, and the assumed reluctance of Americans to accept casualties. Every one of these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. It's worth examining one specific example of Japanese miscalculation: aircraft carriers. At the start of the war, Japan possessed 10 carriers to America's 7 in the Pacific. Japanese carriers were superior in many respects, with better trained pilots and excellent aircraft like the Zero Fighter. Japanese planners believed this qualitative edge would persist. They estimated that even with American industrial capacity, training pilots and building carriers would take years, giving Japan time to consolidate its empire. What they failed to anticipate was the American approach to training. The United States established massive pilot training programs that by 1943 were producing thousands of competent pilots monthly. American carriers, while individually less capable than Japanese designs, were produced in such numbers that quality became irrelevant. By 1944, Japan had effectively no carrier capability left, while America had over 100 carriers in service or under construction. The tragedy of Japan's decision becomes even clearer when we examine what Japanese leaders learned after the war. In interrogations, many admitted that if they had known the true scale of American industrial capacity, they would never have supported war. Former Prime Minister Tojo, in testimony at his war crimes trial, stated that Japan's leadership had been, quote, misled by our own intelligence services and blinded by our ideology, end quote. This admission came too late for the millions of Japanese and Allied soldiers and civilians who died in a war that Japan's own strategists knew was unwinnable. So what conclusions can we draw from this investigation? Japan went to war with the United States based on a combination of strategic desperation, intelligence failure, cultural blindness, and political paralysis. They were trapped by their own expansionist policies into a position where all choices were bad and chose war over certain slow decline. They convinced themselves that American democracy was weakness when it was actually a source of strength. They believed in intangible spiritual factors over material realities. And they constructed a strategy that required their opponent to act irrationally, seeking negotiated peace rather than total victory after being attacked. The lessons remain relevant today. Nations still miscalculate the capabilities and intentions of potential adversaries. Intelligence agencies still fall victim to confirmation bias. Leaders still choose catastrophic policies because the political cost of alternatives seems too high. The difference between 1941 and today, of course, is that modern weapons make such miscalculations potentially civilization-ending rather than merely nation-ending. The fate of Hitler's death pistol remains a mystery, but the reasons for Japan's suicidal war with America are now well documented in archives in Tokyo, Washington, and Moscow. The Japanese leadership knew they would probably lose, chose to fight anyway, and doomed millions to death for a cause that was mathematically impossible from day one. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction proved precisely accurate. Japan ran wild for 6 months, then spent the next 3.5 years being systematically destroyed by the industrial colossus they had awakened. Understanding why intelligent, informed leaders made such catastrophic decisions remains one of the most important studies we can undertake because the capacity for self-deception in strategic planning remains as present today as it was on December the 7th, 1941. As usual, I look forward to reading your comments and discussing this topic further. If you have information about Japanese strategic planning documents or intelligence assessments from this period, please do get in contact. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also consider supporting the channel through the links in the description box below.